Joining us now is great friend, very special friend, the original friend, perhaps the best friend of the show. Glenn Greenwald. It's great to see you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. I accept all of those titles. I think they're all appropriate, and I appreciate the invitation.
It's nice to see your face and be the subject of your mockery again, Glenn. Always
That's right.
a pleasure.
It's been far too long. One of the reasons we want to talk to you, Glenn, on top of just checking in general, let's put this up there on the screen. President Putin yesterday granted Russian citizenship to Edward Snowden. Now, there's been a lot made of this by the U.S. media as some evidence that Snowden himself is like further a traitor, as if he himself should be pushed to the front line by Putin. What did you make of this move and then the general treatment by the Western media of this obvious stunt by Putin?
So first of all, just look at the framing of this. Like, Putin grants citizenship to Snowden. This happens all the time whenever the U.S. media wants you to hate a particular country. They start personalizing everything to the leader. When we wanted to invade Iraq, it ceased being Iraq did this, Iraq did that. Everything was Saddam did this. Same with the war in Yugoslavia. It was no longer Serbia does this. It was Milosevic does this. They always personalize it on a particular leader, as though now Putin is sitting in the immigration office as an immigration clerk reviewing Snowden's application for citizenship and stamping it approved. Of course, it's done in the name of Putin. So many documents are signed by Joe Biden that he wouldn't have the capability to even read, let alone analyze and process. But that's already the framing. Snowden has lived in Russia for 9 years now. He lives there with his American wife and their 2 young toddlers. And the reason they're there, of course, is because the U.S. government has made clear that if he steps 1 inch outside of Russia, they will arrest him and prosecute him and imprison him for the rest of his life under the Espionage Act of 1917. So all this is the natural byproduct of living in a country for a long enough time. I've lived in Brazil 17 years. I'm eligible for citizenship with my family. And yet the American media tried to depict this as some cunning move on the part of Putin, and worse, some sinister evidence that it means Snowden all along was a Russian spy.
I want to pick back up on Snowden, but first I actually want to ask you more about that point about like personalizing the governments, because I think that's interesting, because I actually try to, when we're covering Russia, talk about the Kremlin or talk about Putin versus Russia as a whole, because when you're dealing with a basically authoritarian system, I sort of want to intentionally separate out the ordinary citizens who may or may not support what's going on or may not understand what's going on versus the leadership, like the elites who are actually, you know, running the show. Do you think there's an argument for that, or like how do you see those things and the language there and its importance?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, Russia is an authoritarian and an autocratic regime. A lot of countries in the world are, but it's also a complex country of 70 million people or so. It has all kinds of different power centers and factions and competing interests. The same is true, you know, of almost any country that you talk about, where there's this extremely exaggerated attempt to depict it as this like totalitarian regime, when maybe North Korea and a handful of other small countries really are appropriately characterized that way. There's all kinds of interest in Russia. There's lots of divided public opinions. Putin does have a lot of support, as does the war in Ukraine. Maybe that's because of a propagandized media. Surely that is part of it. But I think it's just so overly simplified, the way that the Western media ends up talking about the countries that we're supposed to hate.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Very important point.
I wanted to get your response to what Snowden himself tweeted in response. He said, after years of separation from our parents, my wife and I have no desire to be separated from our sons. After 2 years of waiting, nearly 10 years of exile, a little stability will make a difference for my family. I pray for privacy for them and for us all.
I mean, I think this is the key point, Krystal, is let's go back and just remember, because before this obsession with Russia completely consumed American discourse in 2014, every major media outlet fought to publish and report on the Snowden documents, and virtually every major media outlet throughout the West did so. Obviously, The Guardian and The Washington Post won a Pulitzer for it, but the New York Times fought for those documents. I remember getting badgered by all their reporters for access to the archive. Globo in Brazil, Le Monde in France, El Mundo in Spain, all over the Western world, people were competing to be able to report these documents because they revealed an incredibly newsworthy story, which was, especially here in the United States, many of the spying programs that were instituted under the war on terror and then increased radically under the Obama administration were found by courts to be unconstitutional and illegal. So what American would be so serf-like in their mentality as to believe that that's not a positive thing? And yet, in response to that, the U.S. government has done nothing but try to imprison Snowden for 8 years. And as he says, he has a family, an American wife, American children. He's always said he wanted to come back to the United States. And so, yes, he does need stability because he can't leave that country. And citizenship is a way that gives him and his family that stability. And to try and depict it as something nefarious on his part, when in reality, the fault lies with the Obama administration that went after whistleblowers using this 100-year-old repressive statute more than any other administration in history, I think is really misguided.
And Glenn, when you pointed out on the Washington Post, which I thought was completely crazy, was that they described Snowden as just a intelligence leaker, which was floated by Matt Taibbi, but also described him as, quote, who considers himself a whistleblower. And as you pointed out, that it's especially weird because they shared that Pulitzer Prize for helping report on some of the Snowden documents at the time and considered it worthy not that long ago in 2014.
I mean, the Washington Post could not heap enough praise on themselves and their courage for the work they did on Snowden documents, when in reality, the Washington Post was too scared to even allow their reporters to go visit Snowden in Hong Kong the way Laura Poitras and I did. The story kind of fell into their lap. He never chose to work with them, but they exploited those documents to their benefit. And the amazing thing is, Saagar, 2 years afterward, when the New York Times was calling for Snowden to be pardoned, the Washington Post editorialized against a pardon for their own source, advocating that their own source be imprisoned. And their argument was that Snowden's documents weren't just about domestic spying, but also spying on other countries. But let's remember, all of the choices that were made about which Snowden documents would be concealed and which ones would be published weren't made by Snowden, but were made by the newspapers with whom he worked. And the Washington Post did more than any other media outlet, way more than I did, in publishing documents about how the U.S. is spying on other countries. So it was they who revealed those secrets, not Snowden, and then turned around and used their own behavior as a way of arguing that he shouldn't get a pardon.
Where do you think that this ideological positioning of the Washington Post comes from? Does it represent a break with past traditions or a continuation of a long tradition that perhaps was, temporarily broken so that they could bask in the limelight of prizes from reporting on the Snowden documents?
So I've never been somebody who thought that the corporate media is quote unquote liberal. Nor did I ever think they were conservative. I believe the ideology of the corporate media is pro-establishment. And in particular, they're particularly deferential when it comes to the U.S. security state. And all the stories that we've seen over the last 20 years that received so much criticism, from the Iraq War to Russiagate to the 2008 financial crisis, were all about these media outlets being completely subservient to ruling elite power centers. And the reason why media outlets dislike Snowden and Assange and so many people like them, even though those people are the ones enabling journalists to do the job they claim they're there to do, is because their sources inside the CIA and the FBI and the Justice Department and the White House hate Snowden and Assange, and therefore they just reflect reflexively those same biases. That is what these media outlets are for.
Right. And I mean, what's the future here for Snowden and by the Biden administration? I don't know if you saw this yesterday, Glenn, but the White House referred all questions on Snowden's citizenship to the DOJ, indicating that the prosecution in the current policy continues under this administration, which was considered, extreme even at the time under the Obama administration when they were also in charge.
Let me just use your question, Saagar, to make 2 points that are actually related. One is that this whole idea of Snowden being in Russia and the way they use that to suggest he was a Russian spy. Let's remember that he didn't choose in the first instance to go to Moscow. He went to Hong Kong and he was there when he contacted us. And at the time, you can go back and read the same stories from the same outlets. We're accusing him of being a Chinese spy. Why, if he were a Russian spy, would he have gone and to Hong Kong and called us there instead of to Moscow in the first instance. But the more important point is, when he left Hong Kong, he was trying to get, everybody knows, to Ecuador and Bolivia, where he was going to ask for and receive asylum, the way Ecuador had given asylum to Assange. And he had to transit through Moscow on his way to Havana, and the Obama administration, led by Joe Biden, did everything possible to block him from leaving Moscow. Ben Rhodes bragged in his own book about, he called the Cubans and said, if you want us to lift this embargo, if you want to have better relations with us, you better not do anything to help Edward Snowden get out of Moscow, because if you do, there'll be no political space to do it. The reason he's in Russia isn't because he chose to be, it's because the Obama administration forced him to be, precisely so that they could turn around and get morons to think, oh, well, if he's in Russia, he must be a Kremlin spy. And that is the problem. Is it was the Trump administration considering actively pardoning Snowden. I think it was one of Trump's more cowardly moves not to have done that. The reason he didn't was because the second impeachment trial was hanging over his head, and Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham made clear, and Mitch McConnell, if you pardon Snowden, we're going to vote for your own impeachment. But he didn't. And now the Biden administration, was a part of the Obama administration, is continuing this repressive attack on whistleblowers that led to Snowden not being able to come back to the United States in the first place.
Yep.
I had never heard that before, Glenn, that there was a threat from Rubio and Graham and some of the more like hawkish pro-security state Republicans to potentially vote to convict Trump in that impeachment hearing over Snowden. Is there, just explain that a little bit more to me, because that's a new piece of information for me.
Yeah, so, obviously I was somebody who was working very actively, both publicly advocating, but also in private, doing everything I could to secure a pardon for both Assange and Snowden, Snowden being my source and Assange being someone I regard as heroic. And there was real movement inside the Trump administration to give particularly Snowden a pardon. They came much closer to Snowden than they did to Assange. And if you think about it, why would they have initiated an impeachment proceeding against a president who within a couple of weeks was on his way out? And the reason, Krystal, was that they were very afraid that on his way out, Trump was going to do a bunch of stuff, including not just giving pardons to Snowden and Assange, but also declassify all kinds of documents he had been threatening to declassify about the CIA, about the Kennedy assassination. And the only leverage they had against Trump doing what they considered crazy stuff on his way out was the second impeachment trial. And they explicitly communicated to Trump, multiple Republican kind of hawkish senators did, that if you do what we know you're thinking about doing, what Rand Paul and Matt Gaetz and others were encouraging him to do, which was pardon Snowden, that will severely jeopardize your chances of getting out of this impeachment trial with an acquittal. And that was the kind of sword of Damocles hanging over his head during that transition.
All right.
Does that relate to the documents that he then takes to Mar-a-Lago? Because there's some reporting that the documents that he took there were, related to Russiagate. They were things that, he had flirted with declassifying before, but didn't for whatever reason. Do you know if there's a connect there?
What I know for sure is that Trump was threatening to declassify all of those documents relating to Russiagate because Trump believes, I think with a lot of validity, that there were crimes committed, or at least ethical transgressions committed during the 2016 election to create and manufacture Russiagate. It came out of the CIA. And I don't know exactly which documents he took. Nobody really knows exactly which documents he took, but it certainly seems to align with everything I knew at the time, which was that Trump wanted those documents public, had the power to declassify them, and now his defense is that he did. I'm not saying that those are the only documents he took. He probably took a bunch, being Trump, just kind of did it all recklessly. But I would think there's certainly a relationship between his belief that documents were being hidden that should be seen and his decision to remove a lot of documents out of the White House to Mar-a-Lago.
Wow. Yeah, that corresponds with some of the reporting that Ken Klippenstein, for example, has been doing. Well, we covered a lot more ground than I even expected us to get to. A lot of interesting revelations there. Right. Glenn, it's genuinely great to see you. Thank you so much.
Great to see you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, congrats on your success. Always happy to come back anytime.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
See you guys.
All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate it. As we said, tickets are on sale for Chicago, live show, October 15th. Come see us. Link is in the description. If you want to help us fund the expansion, we've got the Counterpoints discount going on right now, 10% off. Otherwise, we've got great content for you on Wednesday, full show for you on Thursday, and Counterpoints for you on Friday. I love being able to see that. Only capable because of all of you and all your support. We will see you all later.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.